my goal for my podcast, from like I said, the very beginning was I wanted to help business owners create brand equity for their businesses, right?
Mhm.
And so everything I do about my podcast, everybody I bring on, every question I ask, when I edit it, I'm always putting my head in the mindset of my listeners who are entrepreneurs and business owners and
Right.
what is going to help them.
Hey there, and welcome to a brand new episode of Delivering Marketing Joy. I am your host, Kirby Hasseman, and joining me today is a branding badass. She's a brand new guest to the program, a brand new rock star. She's a podcast host and senior account manager for Genumark, Joelly Goodson. Thanks so much for joining me.
Kirby, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And, before we get into it, I just want to say congratulations to you because you're doing an amazing job with this podcast that you're doing and this YouTube series and everything. And you're helping so many people. So I'm honored to be here, honestly. So thank you.
You're too kind. You're too kind. Thank you
It's
so much.
true.
I appreciate it. Well, I actually want to talk about your podcast because, you have this incredible and incredibly successful, by the way, I've seen on, I think it's Good Pods that you were one of the top 100. It's a podcast called Branding Matters. So people should check that out. So I'm curious, why did you decide to launch that? I think it was in 2021. Is that right? And then
Yep.
What was the goal?
Well, do you want the long version or the short version?
Bring it. Bring me the long version. Sure.
Okay, I'll tell you the long version. I'll try to make it short.
Okay.
So before I launched, just FYI, I never listened to a podcast, so I knew nothing about it. Never listened to any. And then in September of 2020, I was invited to do a presentation to a networking event, a women's networking event, and then with COVID and we were on lockdown, they asked me, they said, okay, we have to do it online now. We can't do it in person. So, at the time online, I was like, what? How am I going to present? I love doing presentations, but I love, I feed off the energy of the audience,
Totally.
right? And so doing it online, I was like, what? And I was going to cancel because I'm like, how am I going to do this? But I committed to it. So I said, okay, I'll still do it. So I ended up doing this presentation and it was about branding. My background, just quickly, I used to be in advertising. And so I have a marketing advertising background. And so it was about branding. And then after the event, I had a few people reach out to me, different people, and they basically said the same thing. They're like, thank you. I loved your presentation. I worked for a corporate company. I got laid off because of COVID and I started my own business and I know my business, but I know nothing about branding. And you said a lot of things that really resonated with me and, I need help. And they asked me, do you do consulting? And I didn't do consulting. I was busy and
Sure.
so I just sort of said, no, but I can help you, whatever you want. And I walked away from that thinking, okay, well, if those are a few people from a small audience and COVID is a global pandemic and a global issue and forced entrepreneurship was a real issue that was happening, I thought, okay, well, this is obviously something bigger. And I mentioned it to my boyfriend in passing, and it's so funny. And he listens to soccer podcasts and he goes, oh, you should start a podcast. And I was like, yeah, right. I knew nothing about them, like literally. And then I thought, okay, because I like to do things I've never done before. So I said, okay, how hard could it be?
Yeah.
And so I thought about it and then came up with the name Branding Matters. It's a double entendre. So it means, branding matters. If you're a business owner or marketer or entrepreneur and you have a business, you really need to have a brand and you need to have a strong brand. And now more than ever, because branding is all about differentiating yourself, right? And standing out from your competition. And so how do you do that? It's by your branding and having a strong brand.
Sure.
But then also branding matters in the sense that I want to cover all different topics about branding. So not just limiting it to about branding per se, but everything that has to do with creating a brand, everything from your brand identity, your logo, your colors, your font, to your merch, which is what we do, right? So all encompassing. So that way I thought I could bring in, and I know what I know and I don't know. I know what I don't know.
Sure.
So I thought, okay, well, I'll bring in experts from all over the world, from all different industries to share their stories and some branding tips that will help my audience create brand equity for their businesses. So that was my goal, honestly. I mean, I know it was a big, audacious goal, but if you're going to dream big. And so I thought that's what I'm going to do. And just kind of started from nowhere. And sorry, I just want to add to that because
Yeah.
I think you'll find this interesting. I don't know if you know Marshall Atkinson. Do you know
Hmm.
Marshall
I do.
Atkinson?
Yeah. 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 Marshall's a good
Okay,
guy.
so talk about serendipity. I was, I hadn't yet even launched it or talked about it or anything, and I was on Twitter, and somehow he and I connected. I can't remember. And then he asked me if I would be on his podcast. He has a podcast called Success Stories.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, why do you want me? I'm not a success story. I had a lot of, I told him sort of my story in a nutshell. And he's like, oh, I think you have a great story and I'd love to have you on. And then I said to him, it's funny that you have a podcast because I'm thinking of doing a podcast, but I don't know anything about it. And he was amazing. He said, well, I can help you. And he sort of gave me some tips and some places to start. And yeah, so I actually owe him a lot because he really sort of helped me, propelled me sort of get into the
Mhm.
podcast space. And then we went from there. So yeah.
I love the shout out to Marshall. Marshall's a great guy. He does that. He was a
Yeah.
guest on this show once, and I'll never forget. He told me the rule of 99 and 1. He said 90% of people on social media are just consumers. 9% will just they curate a little bit. They'll engage or like, and then 1% actually create the content. And so
Oh,
that,
really?
which I never fact checked him on it, but
Yeah.
it tracks, right? It's like
Makes sense for sure.
there's so few people, and that actually leads me to my next question, actually, which is I'm always impressed with content creators, especially those who do it consistently, right? Because it's a challenge. And so, since you've started this, what are some lessons that you've learned from doing it? And I guess I'm always curious to know if anything has surprised you.
Oh, well, I've learned so much. I've learned everything because I walked in knowing nothing, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Completely
yeah.
blind. So I've learned how to edit. And I'm really, really, really picky about editing, actually. It's funny. I've hired a few people to help me and then I've had to fire them because but it's, you know what? I look at editing like telling a story and I think it's like creating art. And
Mm,
so I'm trying to tell a really important story and I have in my head how I want it to be executed, how I want people to receive it.
right.
And so unless you're inside my head, you're not going to edit it the way I want it to be edited, right? So
Right.
I've learned about editing, I've learned about sound, I've learned to be a better listener, which is a huge skill. I had a bad habit of interrupting people when they would talk, and so I've really learned to keep my mouth shut and my ears open. So listening, I've gotten better at that. I've learned how to do that. And I've learned a ton about branding and about business because I get to sit down for an hour with these incredibly smart thought leaders from all over the world. And I've learned so much. It's like private tutoring. So those are a few that just come to mind.
Yeah, and I think they're really good. And it's funny, the two that went together there for me is editing and listening, because when you are editing yourself, you realize how much you are talking over somebody. Like that was such a good lesson for me, because I'm like, shut up and let them finish their sentence. And when
Yeah.
you're editing it, you really see it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I keep a notepad by my side. So if they say something and I want to, elaborate on that or I want them to elaborate on it, I'll just write it down. And so I have it beside me. So that was something that I learned as well. So, pardon me. And then what's been the most surprising? This is interesting. And I'd be curious to hear your take on this is how many people, well, reach out to me to be guests, and then people that I'll just meet. Like when I first started, I wrote down a dream list of guests that I wanted on. Pardon me. And I've had a few on, and that's been pretty exciting. And I reach out to people, and people always ask me, how do you find your guests? And many different ways. But what I didn't expect is people reaching out to me. And
Mhm.
it started off, sporadically. And now, two a day probably I get, because now there's these companies, and that's all they
Yeah.
do is to find podcasts for hosts for guests to be on. And so
Yeah.
I wasn't sure how to deal with that at the beginning, and
Mhm.
but then I've learned to really be true to my brand and what I'm trying to accomplish with my podcast. And I have an automatic message now, so people will see that if we think you're a good guest, like we'll get back. If we think you're a good fit, we'll get back to you. Like I want to be polite, obviously, and not offend anybody because everybody wants to be on.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is when I meet people sometimes, I don't know if this happens to you, and I'll be out and I'll meet someone. And as soon as I say I have a podcast, they'd be like, I'd be a great guest on your podcast. Let me come on and I'll do this. I was at an event a couple of weeks ago when I ran into someone who I haven't seen in a while. I'm not going to say any names. And, we just chatted and they heard I had a podcast. And the next day I got an email saying, hey, I think I'd be a really good guest on your podcast. And this is why. And so that's hard to deal with. Do you ever have to deal with that?
Yeah. I think it's exactly right in the sense that for the first several years, it was hard to get guests. I mean, I would reach out and I would actively reach out to people. And I said that for me, the two things that took the most time were scheduling guests and coming up with the questions for each guest, because I tried to ask different questions. And the Calendly and then, Link, which I fought off doing for a long time, has been the biggest godsend of time in my life. I thought it would be impersonal, and it's made it so much easier for me to kind of get guests on. And then the proliferation of those kind of companies that do book them, that has been really nice as well. But yeah, every once in a while you're like, really? Do you know anything about my podcast? You sent me it has nothing to do with anything we do. So it has been interesting. So
yeah. Cool. And I always, it's interesting. I always ask people when they reach out to me and ask me, I'll ask them, I'll say, how did you discover my podcast? And have you listened to it? Because I want to know before I'm going to commit to anything. I'm curious. And a lot of them haven't, never heard of it. And, called me the wrong name sometimes. Hey, Bob, I think I'd be a really good guest on your podcast. Yeah. Anyway, so it's just funny. I think people in the podcast world can relate to that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I guess, so let's say you're listening to this and you're interested, obviously you've been doing this for some time now. So what tips do you give people if when they're coming and they say, hey, I'll be a great guest, but you're like, no, you should start your own podcast. So how do you tell people to start a podcasting or content journey?
Well, I don't know if I would tell anyone to start a podcast. I mean, I think it's a personal choice. I think there's a lot of value in it. So if someone said to me, and I do get that a lot, which I'm sure you probably do too, is people ask me for advice and tips and help and everything else. And I guess I would say, okay, well, first of all, why do you want to start a podcast? I think some people do it for vanity metrics and they think, they want to be famous or they want to be the next Joe Rogan. I've heard that before and all this kind of stuff, right? So ask yourself, why do you want to start a podcast? What's your purpose? And then once you know what that is, then how are you going to execute that where you're going to actually achieve what you're setting out to do? So for example, my goal for my podcast, from like I said, the very beginning was I wanted to help business owners create brand equity for their businesses, right? Mm-hmm. And so everything I do about my podcast, everybody I bring on, every question I ask, when I edit it, I'm always putting my head in the mindset of my listeners who are entrepreneurs and business owners and what is going to help them. What's going to help them on this journey? I want them to be able to walk away from my podcast with at least one or two tips that are going to help them with their business. And if not, if the guest isn't going to do that, or if the podcast isn't going to do that, then it's all for nothing. And so I guess to answer your question, when you know what your podcast is and what your purpose is and why you're doing it, then just make sure that everything that you do aligns with what your purpose is and keep that in the back of your mind. I think, and and who your audience is. And I think that'll help you.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. And I think that the more you go, the easier it is to get pulled away from that. Kind of to your point about all the guests that do finally start reaching out to you. It's like, nobody knows. And then when people know, they're like, oh, well, you should be talking about stuff that is different from what your mission. And so I think keeping yourself on brand is great advice. Great advice.
Because you know what? I mean, let's be real. There's right now to date 5 million plus podcasts out there and growing, right? Yeah. And so if you're listening to podcasts, there's a reason why people are listening to yours specifically, right? What's in it for them? And that's and I mean, this in marketing, right? What's in it for them? It's not about you, it's about them. So it's the same thing with the podcast. Like, why is someone going to stop and listen to your podcast, whatever they're doing? You better give them a good reason, because there's 4 million, other ones out there. Yeah. So
that's awesome. That's awesome. So, okay. So final question. This has been great.
Final?
Yeah, you're right. I told you it's quick. We did this quick. Yeah.
I know.
So who has been your best teacher or mentor, and what was one lesson that they taught you that has stuck with you?
Is this for life, business, both, whatever?
Whatever comes to your brain. I'm good.
To my interpretation?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I will give a shout out to my late father, Jack Goodson, because he taught me, if anything, he taught me that we're all human beings and that nobody is better than anybody and you're not better than anybody. And that advice has helped me so much because I think it's what gives me my confidence and my, as I say, chutzpah. Like, I'm not intimidated by anybody. I don't think anybody's better than me, whatever your income is or your job position is. We're all human and we all bleed the same color. And at the same time, I don't think I'm better than anyone, right? I'm just a human and I make mistakes and everything else. And I just think we're all human beings trying to do the best we can. And he really instilled that in us growing up. And he was so respectful to all humans. And, you know, just to end that, when he died, so I'm Jewish, and in the Jewish tradition, it's very common, especially where I'm from in Montreal, where you're born, where you're buried in Jewish cemeteries, right? Like they have different Jewish cemeteries. And he specifically wanted to be buried in a non-sectarian cemetery. So he's buried in this beautiful cemetery in Montreal, top of Mount Royal, where he's surrounded by all different races and religions, because that's how what he believed and that's what he wanted. And that is what is instilled in me, where I try to live my life by those same sort of virtues.
That is awesome. That's a good way to end it, Joelly. So real quick, we've talked about your podcast. I have listened to your podcast.
Oh, you have?
Yeah, absolutely. So, but for everybody else, where can they find it?
Well, it's called Branding Matters, and you can find it basically wherever you listen to podcasts, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere else. So thank you. And if you like it, please make sure to rate it and leave a review, because I read all of them and I really appreciate them. And the other thing I want to say before I go, Kirby, is I wanted to also congratulate you on your other podcast that you do, Up Front with Bill Petrie. I was so surprised. You know, I'm always surprised when there's all these lists that come out there. And when you guys someone tagged me and said, Joelly, you're on this list. And then that's how I sort of first got introduced to you guys. I didn't even know you knew I existed. And then I listened to it, and you're amazing, and it's so great. And so I really appreciate what you guys are doing and how you're helping our industry so much. And I love, you know, people always ask me about my podcast and what I love about it. And I love that I've made all these new connections with people all over North America, if not the world, especially in our industry, you know? So next year in Vegas, we'll have to have a drink together.
I would love that. I would love that. And, and I really enjoyed your conversation with Jeremy Picker. That was a really good one.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
he was pretty inspirational.
Yeah, he's
his
a good
story,
dude.
right?
Yeah, he's a good dude. So, thank you so much. This has been fun. We'll have to do it again sometime, okay?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, cool. Well, that's going to wrap up this edition of Delivering Marketing Joy. We'll see you next time. Marketing Joy.